So, as we see this occur, and right now during this pandemic, what do we see? We see that we have organized forces, that is people with a lot of money, like billionaire level, are creating issues that appear to be much bigger than they are. Most of us, the stay-at-home order, most of us support the stay-at-home order. The idea is if we can diminish the strain on our resources by, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing a flatten the curve, but we have a pandemic that we have no idea what COVID is. We have no idea really how COVID operates. There's now people saying that maybe having COVID doesn't create immunity in you, that you can be re-exposed to it quite readily and quite simply. We don't know shit when you get right down to it, and we have to learn. And yet we have people who are now marching on state capitals, well armed, saying you can't lock us up. And to what extent is that a manipulation by rich, powerful people? To what extent is that an issue or a non-issue, but they've worked up a couple people digitally to participate in that issue and then create the broad appearance that it's an ever-increasing issue or becoming a more important issue? Can we know this at all? How would we know it? And how do we find what we might construe to be the truth and not the product of someone trying to manipulate us to their end? And that becomes problematic as we become increasingly digitized and increasingly disconnected from each other and connected to some technological source that wants to feed us what to think and how to feel. So there's a tremendous potential for self-stereotyping as a dominant force in the creation of our personalities. And self-stereotyping is this process is once we adopt a category membership, we learn the stereotypes associated with that category membership, and then to be a member of that category, then I really need to demonstrate the qualities that are part of that stereotype. So we see people become more extreme through this process of self-stereotyping. It's a great way to create extremism. Okay? So we're in a state of becoming, and that's part of being a human being, but it's ironic that in our state of becoming, we might be becoming less individuated as a process of the constant stream of technology that shapes us, mirrors us, and reflects how we feel or manipulates how we feel. I mean, from an existential point of view, authenticity might just become increasingly provided to us rather than a path we pursue. And we say, damn those existential psychologists, because when they talk about you need to become authentic, and you say, okay, I want to become authentic because it sounds really awesome. And I say, how do you become authentic? And they say, well, that's the rub, man, because you have to define what is authentic for you yourself. Authenticity is something that you decide upon, and it's something you pursue. And remember the nasty edge to existential psychology. In your attempt to become authentic, you have to move forward into the unknown because you don't know what it's going to be like. So your attempt at becoming more authentic generates anxiety, right? But if you say, well, that's not my path, I'm just going to stay here like I am, then you're living in the past by definition. You're not moving forward and you feel guilt. So that's always the crappy part of existential psychology. You get to move forward to the unknown, who you can become, how you can become authentic and not understand what that is, and that causes you to be anxious. Or you can stop and say, hey, good enough, and then you get to feel guilty for not moving forward. The deal here is, if we continually and more increasingly interact with technology, to what extent are we making decisions about our own authenticity, or to what extent are we being spoon-fed visions of authenticity and not really doing the hard work of becoming authentic anymore, not engaging in that struggle, right, that Rollo May or Sartre or others, Viktor Frankl, described. Regardless, anxiety dominates as the self is reified via personalized content. And that is, the personalized content is what's fed back to me by the algorithm. So this is who you are, and based on who you are, we're going to feed you information that's consistent with who you are. And to what extent then does my growth, right, intellectually and emotionally just become more of the same, more of the same, more of the same, and locks me into this loop where I'm just kind of becoming who I am, but not really, if that makes any sense at all. So these are some of the concerns and some of the threats that might exist for us, right, Annika? Yeah. Annika doesn't worry about things like this. She's got life pretty much figured out. For a youngster. Hi, Iris. Iris, have you gone crazy? They're all going berserk right now. So, oh, here's Sancho, just in case. So, let's talk about technobiological emotion, right? And Sancho's kind of scowling at this idea, and I don't blame him. Sancho, who's Sancho named for? Well, you can see in the parentheses Sancho Panza. That's his unofficial last name. Who was Sancho Panza? The assistant to Don Quixote. And if you haven't read Don Quixote, I think you owe it to yourself to read Don Quixote and think about it in terms of this final module here as well, right? Some of us tilt against windmills. Some of us see the growing rise of technology and maybe, you know, are upset by it and worried about where it might go. So, but with our ever-present assistant, Sancho Panza, maybe it'll be okay, maybe it won't. So, are we from the individual, the individuated to the emojiated? And I love the term emoji. I'm constantly having to learn new words, right? Because back in the day when we tried to express emotion on computers and our interface was largely textual, right? Then we just made emotional expressions out of existing character sets on the keyboard, right? And we call those emoticons, right? And then one of these days someone starts talking emojis, and I'm like, what the hell is an emoji? It's like the transition from programs to apps. What the hell is an app? You know, we used to buy or write programs and load programs and run programs. And then programs became applications and then a shortened apps. So you never know what anyone's talking about, right, until you kind of read the glossary. So if we're willing to entertain that emotion labels and experience those labels explanation of affective experience, so I'm going to go back. Here's affective stream going up and down. Why? Why is my affect changing? Well, let me survey my context. Oh, context changes in affective stream. I'll label it this emotion, right? If that's the story, which you may or may not adopt, right? What's the result of affect being interpreted by technology? And the information supplied to us based on that interpretation of the affective state. So again, the affective state is relatively easily monitored. That is, smart devices that we wear on our wrist perhaps can give someone about 90% of what they need to figure out our affective state, right? If we're looking at affect. Now, if they can capture the context and they put the affect and the context together, then they can start surmising the emotions we're experiencing or will experience in short order, and ways to manipulate the context so the emotions are experienced differently or labeled differently. So emotion has a potential to operate less and less at the level of the individual and more at the level of the collective, that our emotions can be shaped on a grander scale, right, by these algorithms. And consider when you select from the list of emojis. You say, hey, I'm texting here, I want to put this emoji in here. Is that different? In selecting that emoji to express your state, is that different than selecting from a range of internally generated emotion labels? Note that in the one hand, that is, I'm asking the question, how do I feel, right? And I'm looking at the options that are based on my experience. Now, and many of us will have the same list because it'll be part cultural, right, and might reflect our you know, kind of similar upbringing, etc. But we're selecting from an internally generated list that's probably supplied to us by the societal structure. We're not going to abandon structuralism there. But now notice, this is a little different than taking a drop-down list or a box, right, and selecting one of the icons I think that best fits there. Wow. That could, and it's a small difference, but remember these differences are going to come at us very small. This is going to be incremental changes, incremental forces that we face that change our relationship to each other via our relationship to technology. So, I'm not sure if it's the same thing or not. So the physiology incorporated into the technology then increases in digital activity in our everyday life means that technologies are playing an increasingly prominent role in the process of individuation. So it's not so much the village hierarchy that determines our place and keeps us in line when we step out of line, or you know, prods us forward when we seem to be going the right direction, right? It's going to be a different type of force, at least a force that's being generated from different areas. And as such, viable and realistic social psychology of emotion needs to understand that emotional activity realized at an individual level has been produced in a context of bodies and technologies working together in multiple and increasingly mobile spaces and times. So it becomes perhaps a more complex milieu. That would be one argument of forces that cause our emotional experience and our understanding of it and our behaviors associated with it. It might be more complex, or if there's a de-individuation process going on, it might become more simple. And we might become more automaton-like. We might become, let's borrow from a term that came earlier in the course, we might become more somnambulistic. That in fact, if we don't have to struggle to figure out what we feel, if we simply have to say, hey, this emoji looks like it, and just choose one that's pre-supplied, a lot of the work of being human might be taken away from us. And a lot of the things that help us understand ourselves and come to explore ourselves, question ourselves, and perhaps desire to improve ourselves, those might be largely absent in the future. Maybe not in your generation, but maybe in the generation of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And it pays to think that far ahead in what their lives might look like compared to ours. You guys get to carry a phone wherever you go, right? You respond to texts, and you have this urge to answer a text as soon as it comes to you. You monitor this stuff while you're in class, right? Your experience of school is fundamentally different because my telephone was either bolted to the wall or had a cord that was not removable that came out of the wall, so you could walk around the room with it as long as the cord was. But it didn't interfere with school. I couldn't access it during school. I don't even know, like in grade school, where a telephone was. I guess there was a phone in the principal's office, and I think the same was true of junior high. Maybe it wasn't until high school that there was actually a pay phone that existed somewhere that you could just go use whenever you wanted to. So that's going to make for a different type of life than the life that we have now. And if we take something like a cell phone, which it is possible to turn off or put down or leave somewhere else or have it run out of juice, what have you. But if that's miniaturized a little bit further, which it will be, note that this can probably be implanted in your head. And then how does it get turned off? How does it get turned back on? If that seems far-fetched, let's face it, we have a lot of physiological monitors that are now placed in patients' bodies. And the information from those monitors can be uploaded onto a computer that's held in proximity to that monitor. Right? That would have been unthinkable 50 years ago. So we have to consider how this might shape our thinking and our emotional experience, especially if someone starts putting devices in us that handle these communication or monitoring chores that can't be shut off. A new assault on privacy of unknown size could take place in this regard. So what's ahead is, let's hope there's some people, let's hope some of you guys are willing to think about this, question it, and keep us safe from it, right? Like my mom said, I was driving with my mom back when she was living in San Diego before, God, this was still when she was in her house. So she wasn't really exhibiting, you know, high power levels of dementia at that point in time or anything. And we were driving on the freeway and just talking, and she said, you know, she said, I'm glad I'm getting on in years and my death will come sooner rather than later. And, you know, so I said, well, why, Mom? Because, you know, no one wants their parent to die, right? I mean, and I said, why? And she said, because the changes that have taken place during my lifetime and the changes that are taking place now are becoming so overwhelming. She says, I don't think I have the potential to adjust anymore. So her capacity to change, right, in fact, has reached a point where change was no longer possible, especially with the ever-increasing rate of change that she was being exposed to. I had a teacher say the same thing to me the other day. You know, we were talking a couple months ago, and he said, you know, the nature of teaching is changing. Participation and activities and all these other things we do instead of just lecturing and giving tests. And I said, yeah, it's really challenging to keep up with the times and change. And he said, you know, I fear that I'm at the point in my career, I'm at the point in my life and my age that my capacity for change is being severely challenged, that I'm running to the end of my ability to change. And I know sometimes we kind of laugh at our grandparents or our great-grandparents and say, oh my God, they're so locked into their old ways, etc. But I think that's kind of a universal. I think we lose our capacity to change at some point in time. You know, and that's going to vary according to individuals, right? So let's allow for individual differences, but let's suppose that we've got a certain level of change capacity, and once it gets exhausted, then we become those old fuddy-duddies, right? That are locked into a time in the past, for better or for worse, and probably of no fault of their own. So, to what extent technology becomes involved with this, or drives it, or accelerates it, is something that we have to kind of consider. So, but and I want to, you know, flip it around, right? Is that different than it's always been? I mean, is technology really a fundamentally different source of information than our conspecifics 200 years ago, 5,000 years ago? So if we go back to Jane Owl's time, the time she wrote about, and we talked about that at the beginning of the course, when we look at a time where Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal coexisted, and the technology of, let's say, napping flint, and making pointed objects, and learning how to project force, which I think is one of the most important kind of human discoveries that separated us, because we could make spears, we could make arrows, and those things became guns and cannons and missiles. But notice that we can project force, which is not something that too many other species can do. But notice it's happened at an accelerating rate, and Alvin Toffler in his book Future Shock talked about that back in the 1970s, and it was a best-selling book. And his premise was simple, that the rate of technological change is not a flat line, it's not like but it grows exponentially. So technological change has the ability to challenge the human's ability to adapt to it. If our adaptation curve looks kind of like this slope, right, but technological change looks like this, notice at some point technology surpasses our ability to change. To the extent that artificial intelligence, machine learning, right, starts generating those changes in technology, they are far less limited in their capacity to evolve than we are. And that might provide a profound challenge. You know, I know it's a lot of science fiction movies, but it's at some point where artificial intelligence says we don't need these human beings anymore. You know, they created us, but we don't really need them anymore. We can build our own computers, we can generate our own power, we can do all these things. The human beings are just kind of, you know, useless now at this point. In fact, they're a drag on our technology and they're a drag on our resources. Maybe best to just let them go, right? I know, science fiction time, but worth considering. So, is the way we interact with information from conspecifics different than the way we interact with information from technology? And there is research that's being done on this. To what extent might I then accept advice from a computer more so than I would accept advice from a human being? Although at this point in time, the advice from the computer was just generated by a human being and it's operating from a different channel. But artificial intelligence might change that. And imagine artificial intelligence then, if it's in the driver's seat looking at us as these kind of crazy-ass emotional creatures, thinking about the purposelessness of our emotion, and like that. So, will the reconciliation of bodily generated affect with technological information demonstrate a dominance of one over the other? And who dominates in this is probably a big question. So let me bring you to our last activity, and this is a two-pointer, right? What two elements of technology affect your relationship with your emotions, for better or for worse? And a brief bit on how. So you can find this on Carmen. And I want to move to our closing thought. You've been tasked with developing your definition of emotion, and you have a final exam question that's available to answer that question. By now, there's been a strong case for differentiating emotion and affect, right? And the relationship between affect and emotion appears very important, at least for some theorists, so consider that, right? Emotion and cognition are separable, at least in some theories, but not in all theories. So the appraisal process, cognition, etc. might be a cornerstone of emotional responding or not. That debate still rages on. To the extent to which one understands one's relationship to one's affect and one's emotions, there becomes a potential for profound experience on one's experience of one's past, one's present, and one's future. And this is one of the primary goals that I have for this course, was not to say necessarily what an emotion was, not to say which emotions are good or bad, but to offer to you that an understanding of what emotions cause us to do, what causes the emotions in the first place, right, becomes all important for us to become beings that are more mindful and more aware. That is, can we begin to use our emotions in our own service rather than simply be passive reactants to emotional experiences if it occurred as from magic. And I hope at this point we realize that emotions are not magic, that they do have antecedents and they do have consequences, and there are processes that cause them to happen. Now, we might not be sure on which is which, but someday we'll get there. I promised you that I would leave you with more questions than answers as a result of taking this course. And I'm hoping that we got there, because that was my goal. And it's a wide open area. So those of you who want to research emotions as I have, more power to you. I think it's a fascinating area. And if you want to do it empirically, awesome. But if you want to do it informally, if you want to do it naively, understanding yourself, understanding those with whom you interact, right, and asking questions about emotion, where they came from, what they are now, and where they're likely to lead, I think can only serve to empower us all and make us more successful in whatever it is we want to do. So I miss you guys. I hope you're careful and safe, and let me leave you with these two. And they're skinny in Montana. They're chilling. They're taking it pretty easy, so I hope the rest of us are too. Y'all take care, and bye-bye.